Welcome to COVID and Climate Change Correlations, a weekly video podcast where I, Daniel Sanderson, engage in a stimulating conversation with post-Keynesian economist Steve Keen. And there we are. Welcome, everybody. We've got a special guest with us today, Tyrone. Welcome, Tyrone, to the show.
Hey, nice to meet you guys.
Yeah, we're really happy to have you here, and I think it was a little bit out of the blue. Steve used the phrase "fuck a duck," so we're already knowing that we don't have any censors here, and if they do, they can bleep at will. But yeah, very interesting. You took quite an initiative upon yourself to build out the initial COVID models and some subsequent fun along the way as well. And what kind of prompted you to do that and get involved with the software so intensely?
So basically about 2 years ago, I was looking for a way to model something for small businesses on their ordering practices. So I did a little bit of research and I came across System Dynamics and some of Jay Forster's initial work. And that quickly led me to Steve Keen, because I also have an interest in economics and System Dynamics software Minsky. So that's kind of how I slid into System Dynamics. And over the last 2 years, I have been religious on watching everything that Steve has put out on YouTube and on his Patreon. And he did, I don't know, about a year and a half ago, he was trying to model something, I think, on a North or a South Korea pandemic paper. And
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, he did something briefly, and it never did get finished. And then I believe a few months later, he put out a compartment model, a small version. Yeah. And I saw that. And of course, with COVID-19 being in the forefront of everything, you have friends and family debating on what the issues are, what we should do, how we should react. So that led me into trying to model something with Minsky. And I started off with his model and just and so that's how I got to that model. I worked on it for 6 months off and on, and then in November I went all in. Omicron was coming, to the forefront. So I wanted to complete something for my own gratification on finishing the work.
Look, I've got to say, I mean, this is we'll have to show the model in a moment, but I was just absolutely stunned when I saw your model, because I had built that very small SIR model. And for people who don't know what the jargon is, SIR stands for susceptible, infected, recovered. And that's the basic dynamic model that's done of pandemic. So you're susceptible to it. It starts off with, say, one person who's infected by it. And then, of course, the infections take over the system, and then you have recovery on the other side. And they can be elaborated into susceptible, exposed. So you've got to actually be in contact with an infected person, infected, recovered, dead. So seared models. And the basic one of the reasons they're relatively easy to build in one sense is that pandemics grow much faster than the population. So what you do is you do a model where you effectively assume a fixed population of victims, but a rapidly expanding population of those infected and so on. And I just did that. I only had time, usual story with me. I never have time to finish anything in great detail. And then, where was it, Tyrone? Were you actually on one of these discussions about 2 weeks ago?
Yeah, I think 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago. Yeah. I think I made a comment about how much I liked your software, and
well, I just saw the comment, and you asked about, can I send you my pandemic models? Yeah, sure, okay, yeah. Well, I opened the thing, and I've got to say, I just went, fuck a duck. And I want to show now why I had that reaction. So I'm going to share the screen for a moment. I've got the screen. I've got the model here. So I'll just pop out at this and this. Can you see it?
Hold on, I gotta flick a switch.
It'll take a while to turn
before
up.
we fuck a duck, I gotta flick a switch.
I'll just run it. Hang on, hang on, pardon me. Oh dear, the multiple defined error coming up. Don't know where that's coming from. That's obviously, if you fix this, is not a
that's from the little grouping beside.
Yeah, I think I'll just I'll just shut that down. I'll just go back and whoa. I'll go and this is another one which you just started working on. I've got a feeling it's because I loaded that in Ravel rather than Minsky. So I'll just load your file again in Minsky and see if it works more effectively, more correctly there. So here we go again. Now hit run once more. And here we go. Okay. And there's people, it'll be hard for people to see on screens, I'm sure, but you're seeing confirmed daily cases, now come confirmed daily deaths, hospital capacity testing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is, it's a ginormous model. You've done all sorts of tricks, which I want you to discuss now if you in detail in the conversation today. But the reason that Minsky works so well for this is I pointed out the Godley tables when I did my tiny model, because these are compartmentalized models. So you're either susceptible, or you're infected, or you're recovering, or you're vaccinated, or you're et cetera, et cetera. And normally people stop at 5. You've got 25 here. So you have the people in the population, those susceptible, those are recovered, but it's still susceptible, those are vaccinated, still susceptible, those exposed. My God. Now, that meant, of course, come back to the video screen here, that you could do an incredibly detailed model. So I was wearing a hat, I'd take it off to you. I'm really delighted with what you've done.
Thank you. Yeah.
So,
yeah, it's almost like I got a layman question here. I mean, that's almost like a PhD submittal, right? I mean, isn't that? I mean, like Steve, you're sitting there, you're the head of the department, and you have Tyrone that comes to you and says, what do you think about this? There has to be a question in there. What's the dissertation or whatever? But the work is solid, and I think is that the caliber we're talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, seriously. I mean, I haven't read everything on seared models. I've read a fair bit, but I don't think I've ever seen one on this scale. I know I haven't, period. Okay, I have not seen one on this scale. What I've seen, the biggest I've seen would be once we have the 5 categories: susceptible, infected, recovered, exposed, dead, and where they drag it down to age cohorts. So if you have 0 to 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, 60 to 100, that then gives you 4 times, so you get 20 categories, but it's done on an age basis. And it would be a lot of work to do that in Minsky right now. One thing I want to do actually in future development of Minsky is make Godley tables 4-dimensional. So currently they're 2 dimensions, but like normally what I'd be doing is another dimension would be, normally what I'm doing, of course, is economic modeling with this. So I'd have the firm sector and just have the firm sector as currently it's just a single column. But the reality is the firm sector is lots of firms. So you had a 3rd dimension that way, and then a purchase by one firm from another firm would turn up in the 3rd dimension. And the upper 4th dimensional is multiple currencies. So at the moment, each sheet is it's dollar or it's pound or it's euro. But of course, people have multiple holdings. So that's the 4th dimension. So one of the design ambitions is 4 dimensions. And if we do that, Tyrone could simply say, well, okay, here I have, let's make one of these dimensions rather than, firm sectors, make it age cohorts. So bang, that gives you 4 or 5. And instantly that would, so you would then have to have a definition of how people pass from one age cohort to another. But of course, that's easy. And of course, also be given the fact that pandemics are far faster than population aging. You can even just basically ignore it and stay with fixed categories. And this is what I appreciate about what Tyrone's done. He showed the power of what is unique to Minsky, which is the Godley table. And it's just generally, mate, I think you could walk into an epidemiology department and say, here's my PhD. Okay, you've already done it. You've done the core of the work.
That is a hats off, my friend. That's really impressive there.
That's
Yeah.
really good to hear. I will say, developing the model, it starts with me building any model in Minsky really starts with the godly tables,
Yeah.
because it ensures that stock flow consistency. So with this model, that's how I started. I'm a bit old fashioned. I started with a piece of paper and decided what compartments I wanted. And I debated on age groups, and I decided, from a top down perspective, you're going to get the same data. If you wanted to take, the amount of people that die in my model, because the population, I'm doing this in British Columbia here in Canada, you could just take that data and disaggregate it into the data. You already know 5% of people over 60, let's say, die versus 1% of people under 40. So I thought about doing it. It just would have added a lot more noise to the model, and I wanted to just try to keep it clean.
Yeah, that's a while. That's a sort of sensible modeling decision you have to make when building a model. So you start with something realistic, and you say, will this extra detail be worth it in terms of what I'm trying to extract as knowledge out of the model? And the answer in that case is no. Of course, if Minsky, if we had the funding, and we put the extra 2 dimensions into the tables, and it would be, oh yeah, okay, bang, I'll make them, I'll have a 5-dimensional table, and there'll be 0 to 10, 10 to 30, 30 to 50, blah, blah. And then you'd have, in that case, your model would go from being 25-dimensional to 125-dimensional. But even as it stands, I said, it's got to be the most advanced seared model ever built.
So I have a question about the transition from a second to a third dimension model. How is that? How do the dimensions communicate? Is it some sort of Markov chain, or is it?
No, it'd just be in terms of everything. I mean, Tyrone has to give us a bit of a chat about how he simulated stochastic functions in the model, but that was clever. Okay, I like that. We haven't yet built stochastic components for Minsky, which was obviously one of the many things we do want to add. But he simulated that using chaos theory. Very clever.
Mm-hmm, correct.
But what we would do would still be a deterministic thing, and then a godly sheet. If you defined a third dimension for a godly table, and like normally this would be like firm sector, then what you would say is, well, how many sectors are you breaking industry down into? And like if you took a typical input-output table, that'd be 25 sectors or 106. There's various sizes I've seen of input-output tables. And so you would have 106 sheets. Okay? And then the purchases, when you had if the steel industry was buying off the coal industry, then you'd have an exchange between those 2 sheets. And that would be, in that particular case, that'd be built by simply inputting the input-output table. And that would then be, if it was 25, if you have 25 sectors, it would generate a 25-sector godly table for you, and it would fill in where the entries are. So that's the concept behind that. But yeah, it would be, like say, you'd actually have a third dimension you'd navigate along, page through multiple pages of the godly table. And with the 4th dimension, which is the monetary one, it's the same sort of story.
So that's interesting because it has the possibility for I guess very intricate risk assessments as well. I would imagine because we're modeling real world probably better than it's been modeled before. Am I?
Yeah. The potential of the godly tables is there to literally model the economy down to literally the scale of an individual firm's. The enormous overhead and huge processing capability necessary. But the basic concept generalizes that far. But so let's go back to Tyrone. First of all, I've got to ask you the obvious question. Are you any relation?
No, I knew that question would come up. I pronounce
Very rare last name.
It's Keynes here in North America. It's Keynes over in Britain. So it sounds different, and I am different. And there is no relation unless it's a distant cousin. I will tell you the first economics book I read, of course, was The General Theory.
Whoa, okay. And those who don't know, because of Tyrone's just got his first name here, His surname is Keynes, Keynes. And I've actually had people rip me about my name being Keen and saying I'm trying to create Keynesian economics or Keynesian economics. But you could actually do the genuine thing.
Yeah, that's right.
So tell us about
maybe he has to be the first on the paper then, Steve.
Huh?
Maybe if you guys write a paper together, he has to have the first name there just to get,
Keynes
just to
and
see.
Keen.
Yeah.
What's your situation, Tyrone? We don't know much about your career and all this jazz. So
I work in a factory, in a production factory. So I deal with real world complex systems every day.
Okay.
I guess I'm in a bit of a transition in life right now, wondering what I really want to do in life.
Yeah.
All the people around me have, found their path, and I've kind of, like a lot of adults, I just had to work and pay the bills, and I never really pursued any of my dreams. Economics has been an interest of mine since the great financial crisis. The first question I asked in '08 was, what is money and where does it come from?
Right.
And I was shocked to find out it was a loanable funds version that I got, but the fact that money comes out of debt, it just, boom, it blew my mind, and I was hooked ever since. And I guess for 7-8 years, I was studying neoclassical material, and I couldn't understand any of it. And I've come to find out it's
all garbage.
It's all garbage. It doesn't make sense. You hear neoclassical economists talk about their work. If they do say something sensible, it has nothing to do with their model. And if it does have something to do with the model, it's not right. So, so over the last few years, of course, watching your stuff and kind of getting into that post-Keynesian, viewpoint, it's, changed my opinion greatly.
Wow. So did you get engineering? Was that your academic background?
No degrees. Zero degrees. High school education, straight to work.
Mate,
wow, good for you.
You're quite an impressive human being, because what you've done is, that is engineering caliber work to do what you've done and how you put that model together. And you didn't have to write any differential equations, did you? Because Minsky effectively does that for you with the Godley table.
Yeah.
But what about you did actually write something. You did the differential equations for the Lorentz system. So tell us about that.
Yeah. So that's just basically it's two separate Lorentz models, which I learned from you. Yeah. And what I wanted, because this is a deterministic model, there are limitations. I want it graphically, so when I showed my friends or anybody that was interested, I wanted something to look real. So I needed a random element. And I did a little bit of research into like stochastic models, which are really great if you're isolating an outbreak locally. With a deterministic model, you can go under one person infected, and technically then the outbreak should be over. But with a compartment model, I could be at 0.5 people infected, and it'll take off again as soon as I relax the restrictions. But anyways, with my model, I just wanted that element of randomness, and I can't really do that in Minsky because of the type of program it is. So I was watching some of your videos. I saw that chaotic output from that model, and I thought, there I go. So I literally took one of your demo models from GitHub, and I just copy and pasted it twice, changed a few of the variables, and then divided it so it was in a small range. I used one of them for my exposure rate. So right now, the model pretty much starts at doubling time of 3.75 for exposures. Well, that in my model, that is being generated by one of the Lorentz systems, and it'll fluctuate between 1 and 4. And that just gives that chaotic look. So my graph's not going like that. It's
Yeah.
like that, and
Yeah.
not just for the prettiness of it, if I can call it that. I pictured myself showing this to a policymaker and him trying to make decisions, but a policymaker would have to deal with the fact that there's ebbs and flows, even during a
Yeah.
week or a 2 week period, and how they would react to that, and would they stay the course despite that noise. So that's why I put those in there. And those
Yeah.
are just ordinary differential equations. Really,
Yeah.
it's not that complex, but you get that chaotic result out of it.
The funny thing is, in fact, when you actually run a random number generator on a computer, you're actually running a chaotic program, because computers are deterministic. We don't have we don't have Heisenberg uncertainty systems determining what the chips generate. So it's actually a highly unstable, chaotic number generator that gives you what are called pseudo-random number generators on a computer. So what you've done, again, is fundamentally do what computer developers did in the first instance to simulate random numbers. So again, you've done, you've got a great imagination and a great capacity to take the tool and run with it. So you're one of two people that I've met, well, three now. Two are master's students of mine, well, one a PhD. So Pedro Pratas, who built a model of the Portuguese economy. Have you taken a look at that one? You must have.
I have dug it apart, tooth and nail. For one, that model I love. I know you've said in a lot of your lectures that it looks crazy, but he did a great job laying
He
it
did
all
a great
out,
job, yeah.
right, and
Yeah.
bookmarking it all. His model inspired me to make sure my layout was the way it was. Even though it's so huge, and to a person who's not used to looking at these models, it can look chaotic, but to a fellow researcher, you can see that detailed work.
I'm going to share the screen again and just show that, because that, again, what you've done is makes it a really nice model to look at. So just if I zoom in here, what you've got here is you've laid out each of the different transitions. So first time exposure, recovery exposure, vaccinations, etc., and you're using a whole range of time constants to do that. So the beta is a time constant for first time infection, exposure factor. It's so beautifully done, and you've had to work bloody hard to do it, as I know, because if you just zoom in here and take a look at this first one, you've actually had to move each one of those individually, because we don't yet, and this is just a relatively trivial piece of programming, what we should be able to do is simply select a lot, right click on the menu, and the right click option should include a line left to line right, blah, blah, blah. But that's one of the many features we want to add to the program, but we haven't done it yet. So you did it all the hard way, but it looks beautiful. And if you wanted to take a decision maker through it and say, what's the logic behind this model, then it's easy for you to follow what you've laid out there.
Yeah.
So, what's next? What's next for you? I mean, I'm going to ask Steve too, because I would like him to give an update on kind of the current status of the software and where we're at. But Tyrone, what's that's quite an initiative. What are you hoping to get involved with? Would you like to do more work with Steve, or what are your thoughts?
Oh, for sure. I'm a bit of a giddy fan of his, so any opportunity to just to send an email back and forth and get a thought from him, or if I can give some input on how a user feels about Minsky, in a practical setting, because I know doing work you can get stuck in your own ideas, and it's really nice to have some random guy come along and say, well, what about this, right? So of course, anytime I can correspond with Steve, it's great. It makes my day.
Anytime you write me a note, mate, your notes get read. There's an absolute guarantee on that front. So at that informal level, definitely. But what I'm thinking, actually, we actually might do this as a next discussion, Dan, is, as I said, there's there are two other guys who've done this brilliant work showing what Minsky can do. And one, of course, is Pedro Pratos, who did this model of the Portuguese economy. Just to backtrack on that, when I first built Minsky, up till about 2017, I sort of knew you couldn't really use it to build a model of a large economy because it was just too cumbersome, too slow to work through. Well, Pedro was doing his master's at a university in Spain at the time. He has an undergraduate degree in statistics, so he knows his mathematics extremely well. He didn't know you couldn't do it, so he did it. And this is really a very sophisticated model of the Portuguese economy. Some elements I don't like about the model, and that is that he used a lot of constants at various points, which he derived them elsewhere and just typed them in. So what Tyrone has done is all the elements that are parameters, and the parameter's got a name, and then the parameter comes from data and so on, and you can see what the source is. So currently, Pedro is doing his PhD now. He started doing it with me, and then when I left the university sector, he had to move to another place. So he's working with a great guy at what's called SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, Yanis de Firmos, who's another top-class stock flow consistent modeler in post-Keynesian economics, lovely bloke too. So Pedro's finishing off there. So Nick, the other guy is Nick Jackson, and Nick was an engineering student, graduate, who came to do a master's with me at Kingston, and his previous job was controlling the navigations of all the oil platforms on the North Sea. Okay? So one serious engineering background there.
Yes.
And he was working in production too, I think, by the way, Tyrone. Anyway, he then decided to model the shadow banking system, and he did this brilliant Minsky model of the shadow banking system. And he then applied for a job at the Bank of England before his master's had been awarded to be the specialist on modeling the shadow banking system, and he got the job. So that was like a real plus for the Bank of England for being that open and hiring a non-orthodox economist who didn't even have a master's in economics at the time. Of course, he got it. Then these are three people out of the blue. So Tyrone, Nick, Pedro. There's one other guy I want to include as well, and that's another Canadian, Tim Gooding. Have I mentioned Tim Gooding to you at all? Okay. Well, Tim he's now living in Taiwan. Long story. Like me, he escaped England, and his girlfriend happened to be Taiwanese, not Thai. So he went to Taiwan, and I went to Thailand. But he did multi-agent modeling, and it was just brilliant stuff. An interesting background in Canadian Aboriginal work as well, because he worked with an Aboriginal community trying to bring in market reforms in the whole society. Didn't fall apart, but the so-called reform, following neoclassical ideas, ended up destroying the basis of the culture to a large degree. But what I'd like to do is bring together all these people. So they have it'd be Pedro, Nick, you again, Tyrone, Tim. He doesn't have much knowledge about Minsky itself, but he knows it, of course, because he did his PhD with me. And Russell Standish, and to have a nice old gab fest around the whole lot of us. So maybe not next week, maybe say a month's time, repeat and bring all those people together and have a good chat here.
Easy enough to do. So looking forward to that.
So Tyrone, would you like to talk us through the model?
Sure.
Okay.
I can do that. Do you want me to share my screen?
Share your screen, and because you know that far better than I do, of course.
Let's see. I don't know. Am I sharing now?
Hasn't started yet.
You've
got to click in the. When you do that, with the share button is grayed out until you click on the actual image of the screen.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's messed up. That's a good Google thing, eh?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So am I showing?
Yep.
Okay. So basically, Steve already kind of went through the godly table. I can zoom in here, and basically, for anybody, you can understand N equals your population. Obviously, when the pandemic starts or any outbreak, the entire population is most likely susceptible. From there, you drift into exposed, which is E, and in this model, then you become infected. Once you get to infected, there's two routes. You can either recover, and in my model, it's about 18 days to recover, or you can be quarantined. Now, in my model, the difference between infected and quarantined is basically being detected or not detected. So when you're looking at my graphs and the numbers, it's looking at your quarantine numbers. There was a study in a small Italian village right at the beginning of the pandemic, and some of their numbers, they were able to quarantine this entire village. I think it was about 3,000 people, and they tested everybody, and they did it multiple times. And the results both times for the people that were infected, I think it was 42.5% were asymptomatic. And in the one group of testing, and then in the second go around, I think it was at 39. So that I had saw that report right at the beginning, and it was shocking to me because I understood the gravity of our reaction is probably not going to do it with the lockdown measures we had in Canada. So anyways, in this model, that's where these infected compartment is not tracked in the data. And I wanted to do that. So if a policymaker did, deal with my model, there would be a buildup of infected people growing exponentially before they would see it in the tested, the detected people, people in quarantine. So that's kind of my logic there. I could do a bit more work in combining that with my testing to make it more realistic, maybe somewhere down the line. After quarantine, you can recover or you can go to the hospital. Followed by going into intensive care or recovering, followed by being mechanically ventilated, which is getting pretty bad, or hopefully recovering, and then finally dying or recovering. Anywhere along that line, you can slide into this recovered compartment. Not dying, obviously. There's no recovery from that. And you can be vaccinated if you are in the susceptible category. In my model, I obviously I don't start vaccinations until about a year in, so it doesn't apply right away. Now, once you get into these two compartments, you go right back to the beginning. You do that same line over again, except now let's say this is vaccinated susceptible, and you go through that whole process again. And I have parameters, so if you've been recovered or vaccinated, the chances of you having severe sickness lessens. The chances of you dying lessens. So that effect comes out in the model later on with a smaller case fatality rate, which is kind of interesting.
So I have a question, Tyrone. At this point, is this a third dimension that we were talking about earlier? Because it seems to run in parallel with the first thread.
In a sense, yeah.
In a sense, right? And I could go even further, right? I could have vaccinated for your second dose, vaccinated for your booster, right? And it would create these lines again. It would create that many more flows. You could go forever, right? But it would become so complex that it would just be a mess of data, right? And I just wanted something that was functional, in depth, and realistic, but not out of control. And I could have done that. I've got the OCD to do it, but I didn't. I eventually stopped because I do have a day job. So anyways, that's the godly table. To move, we'll go into the equations. Like Steve was saying, it's all ordinary differential equations. Really, up until 2 years ago, I had grade 12 math. So this isn't very complex. Like I've seen like Petro's model. There are parts of it I don't understand. And I can't remember his name. The one that did the shadow bank with all the
That's Nick
logic,
Jackson.
yeah, with
Nick
all
Jackson.
those logic switches. Oh my, like that to me is complex. This is really basic.
They're not so hard, actually. I mean, you should actually give it a try, because the logic, we've still got to refine the logic switch, because the way Russell's defined it is what's called a Heaviside function. And Heaviside is either 0 or non-zero. So if the switch evaluates, if the condition for the switch evaluates to 0, then you get one condition. If it evaluates to non-zero, you get another. And what he realizes, we need to actually generalize that quite a bit. So you want to have, 0 to 0.25, 0.25 to 1 to 5, and so on to 0.5.
Yeah,
But anyway, it's just a little switch. And you could use that quite effectively in your model as well.
Yeah. So
I have a question about that on-off, the 0 to 1. How does that? I'm a little bit of a layman when it comes to this,
well,
but
I can show you. I do have them for my lockdown. So I'll just show you. This is where all my lockdown equations. Now this is the result of one of the Lorenz system right here, generating that number. And this is my exposure rate. And obviously in my model, how do I stop or slow down the rate of infection? Well, slow down the rate of exposure. So I use this number, and here is a switch, let's say, for personal services. You can see it can go 0 or 1. Yep. 0 has the little line here in the middle of the box connected to a value of 0. If I switch it to 1, it goes 1 down to number 1, and now it go to 0.5. That 0.5 gets added onto the 3.75, which becomes 4.5. So now my exposure rate's a doubling time of 4.5. That's how the switches work in Minsky. With the shadow banking model, though, it was switch over switch, like it was daisy.
And that's why,
And I thought it was incredible. Like,
what Nick has done is nail on because Nick, with a background in engineering and mathematics, Heaviside functions are part of what you understand. So he got the concept immediately, and then he uses multiple switch on switch on switch. But this is a lot of development in Minsky is very iterative. So you get an idea worked out, and then when you try it, you find, oh, it should be really doing this, and then there's another development of the software as well. So with the switch, what Russell has finally appreciated is that you should be multiple inputs up the top and multiple outputs on the side, so more than one condition. And then what would happen is there'd be the little idea that you just illustrated. Hit the 1 and the 0 again on that close personal services, were you, Tyrone? Or just one or the other, doesn't matter. You go. So like the fact that the switch changes from one to the other was one of my ideas, because I wanted Minsky to be as visual as possible so people could see what was actually happening. So not just the graphs coming out, but what logic is being executed as well. So that was pretty easy to do. So what we do with again, this takes funding. I've got to pay Russell something like about, I imagine, 2 weeks programming to do this, but that would then have multiple inputs, and there'd be inputs as well, fluctuating as well as which ones are chosen as the output. But what Nick did was do a cascade of one logic switch onto another logic switch and blah, blah, blah. And that's where the complexity that Taron's talking about comes in Nick's model.
So in theory, what's the fix to put like some sort of more of a function, a drag and drop element that adds a complex series of switches? Is that kind of the idea?
What you just have is like you have what Taron's got in the top. The top input to the switch is either 0 or not 0. Okay. So what you'd have is it'd be top input would be 0 to 0.25, 0.25 to 0.5, etc., etc. And then your conditions on the other side would be saying, if this value is 0, then that result. Else, if it's 0 to 0.25, then another result, etc., etc. So you could actually all the complexity that was in Nick's model of all those just cascading multiple logic, which gives become one switch to the whole thing. But
it's like it's like a dial. You can just kind of dial it in.
Tyrone, back to you. Talk us through a bit more.
This is the foundation of me slowing down the spread of the virus is all these lockdown measures. And basically, when we run the model, you can switch these as the simulation's running, and you increase the doubling time with exposure, which slows down the virus. So that's kind of that part. And I have quite a few conditions. I could have added more, but in some ways, this is still a big toy model. Like if somebody said, you know what, you're going to go meet Bonnie Henry, who's our health minister here in BC, in 1 month, I would be making a lot more parameters for lockdowns. But I did try to include a lot. Outside of just the ordinary differential equations and how they slide into the different compartments, the rest of the equations are for the graphs. So I just tried to keep them separate, right? This one's for active cases, and you'll notice I don't have infected, because those are the cases. Those were those 40% of the people we don't know about that are still spreading the virus, but display no symptoms and have no idea that they're spreading the virus.
Right.
So, and the other part would be setting your parameters. And again, I could do more work to this. Right now, I have them somewhat to the data I have for British Columbia. So days in the compartments, exposure to infection, the doubling time, 5 days. So essentially 5 days from exposure, and then you're infected. Recovering 18 days. Now, all these parameters, I've added those Lorenz systems to. So these are the static parameters I can pick, but then in addition, I add the Lorenz system output. So this 5 here, infection, the quarantine, is fluctuating. And that just gives that more realistic, chaotic, day-to-day aspect that we faced over the last 2 years of. You can see it in the data on any graph, how it kind of looks wild at some point, and you don't know what's going on. So that's, been added to all of these. Right here, it's just saying, 65% of infected people will be quarantined. They'll find out they have the virus. And then, 5% of the quarantined people end up in the hospital, and so on.
Yeah.
One part, another weaker part of my model is I'm working on the breakthrough right now to make it realistic. Essentially, I've got 90% of the vaccinated people there, they will become susceptible again. I don't know the real data on that. I'd have to dig through it, but to make my model work, that's where it's at. So that's just something you can set wherever your region is, because it differs depending on what strain is spreading in your region. So, and then the final part is what I call the dashboard, and this is the part that I would want a policymaker to see. All the rest is great for other researchers, but I don't want to sound critical, but you have to simplify things. I think for people that aren't, don't know system dynamics or math, right? So
what you've done here is exactly what my ambition is for Minsky in the long term as an economic modeling system, because I want to be able to show people an intricate model of the economy and the ecology, of course, these days, and then say, okay, here are your parameters, and this is the logic, first of all, to what you've done elsewhere in explaining the variables and the differential equations and the godly table and so on, take them through step by step, and then say, okay, here's your control mechanisms. And what I'd ideally like to have is capacity for a dozen people to be working on it, because in policymakers, you're going to end up with somebody who's handling the quarantine, but somebody else is handling health, et cetera, and then vary the parameters and see what happens and simulate the real world before you fall into it, which is unfortunately we've done the other way. We've fallen into the real world. Now we're trying to simulate the catastrophe we're currently in.
Exactly. So I'll run it through a few waves just to give a demonstration here. Right away, you're going to notice the Lorenz system in this lockdown intensity index right here. You can see it's fluctuating.
Yeah.
And I've changed the runge cutter, so I'm moving in 1 period increments, which I know nothing about that. So it was a bit of trial and error to get it going, right around 1. And I just wanted to have 1 day increments to make it look realistic instead of continuous time. I also used the floor operation to round down all my infections, so they'd be whole numbers.
Yeah.
So right now it's where almost a month and a half, we're hitting 5 cases per day, 26, 31 active cases. At this point, in the pandemic here in Canada, we were all pretending like it won't be a big problem. Of course, it did become a big problem. And then you can start, and I'm not going to do this in any specific order. We'll say, a state of emergency is announced, provincially as well, non-essential travel, indoor gatherings, limit those, only gatherings of 10 people or less. Government shutdowns, nightclubs, personal services.
Are you turning those on and off? Is that what
you're doing? That's right.
Turning them on. Yeah.
Wow.
Social distancing. We'll shut down some of the elective surgery to add more capacity, which is ultimately the big thing, is how can our healthcare system cope with the multiple waves? That's ultimately the end game of this. If that wasn't an issue and we had endless hospital space, with treatments for COVID, it wouldn't be an issue. But at this point, we have limited hospital space. So this, in the model, we're in about May of 2020. If we say we started in January 2020, and this would match pretty closely to the data in BC. We're on the downside of the first wave, and the rules were slowly starting to be relaxed. Personal services were reopened. Here in the Western world, we have I find a real sense of we know best and we conquer our modern mechanisms of functioning can solve anything. And I found 2 years ago when we were coming off the first wave, I really felt that.
Yeah.
I knew there was going to be multiple waves. I already looked at the pandemic of 1918, the Spanish flu. So I really had that feeling that we were letting off a little too early. Then we got summer. They let school back in for a month here in BC. We'll say the government gets back to work, restaurants, school's back in, so we'll have a little bit more gathering. And these switches, you can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's just not just 0 and 1.
Yeah.
So with my gathering parameters, I have different intensity, basically 50% shutdown, 25% shutdown, etc. Then school shuts down for the summer. You're allowed to travel. Else is acting up here.
I'll just mention as well, by the way, you mentioned to me, of course, in the email, Tyrone set the simulation speed to the slowest possible. so you can actually have this sort of conversation step by step. So if you speed it up, it'd happen too quickly to make the variations to show the policy effect.
Especially because I changed going from one period to the next. If I ran this on full speed, I couldn't change any of the parameters.
Here's the second wave turning up now.
And here's the second wave. And in BC, I can speak because I was living through it. This was time when the health officials were saying there's going to be a second wave, but we were all kind of sticking our heads in the sand. We just thought, you know what, it can't be like the first time. It actually turned out to be worse. So really it picked up when school goes back in September, which is day 240. Just turn that on and get it going here. So basically,
how incredible! I think
I'm not going to run the whole thing here because it would take too long. But that's basically my model is saying if we have this on and off with restrictions, this is what we're going to get: waves. Steve's mentioned this often. If we had just done this for 6 to maybe 4 months in the beginning, we could have got, and collectively as a planet, obviously that would be the most ideal.
Tyrone, I'm going to drag you in again because there's one more person I want to have see your work, and that's Yanir Baryam. Now, Yanir, like you mentioned him, if you see me on Twitter, I mention him quite frequently. He's the guy who led the program to control the Ebola outbreak in Africa. And I've seen people trash it and say Ebola's, not transmitted to but African funerals involved you touching the corpse. So he had to get the Africans to not touch the corpse for 2 weeks or more, a period of 2 weeks. When anybody died, you didn't touch them, and that stopped the transmission. Now, that's a huge behavioural change for Africans, but they did it, and they therefore broke the outbreak. So that wisdom is, and the trouble is, poor old Yanir, he's a brilliant man, and he knew what to do, and he said if a 6 to 8 week period, we could have eliminated the virus from the planet if we'd done a strict lockdown and not release stuff all the time. And you can talk about this till you're blue in the face and nobody will bloody well listen to you. But if you simulate it like you've just done, Tyrone, then you can say this is why it failed. Because what we're looking at there wasn't real data, it was simulating the behaviour of policymakers and showing what the consequences were.
And you can drastically see that in the data with the lockdown measures, especially here in Western Canada between the province of British Columbia and Alberta. Alberta is essentially, this might insult some Albertans, but it's the Texas of Canada. And they have a very, self-orientated way of thinking and don't control my life. And they did have measures there, but people didn't buy into them. And you can see that similar populations, you can see the result of that. And of course, in America, with 50 some different states with different health policies, and their views down there, a great portion of them are, don't take away my rights. So, and I think
don't impose any responsibilities on me either.
We had a chance in the beginning with the first wave and maybe the second wave of being with our health officials being consistent with the lockdown. But as soon as you declare victory after the first wave and then you do it after the second wave, you start losing that legitimate factor. It makes it, now we're in wave 5. It's very hard to you can implement a restriction, but will people buy into it? Whether it's enforced by law or not, it's difficult to enforce a whole.
You're seeing you're getting those riots in Toronto. Trudeau to bring in emergency powers. There's similar stuff happening in Australia as well. There's an occupation outside the Parliament House, and same sort of behaviour. So you've delegitimised what would work if it was done properly.
Yeah.
And what you've illustrated is, but it'd be great to show, like as you could do with this model, start saying, well, here we're going to strict. No, we're not going to make those mistakes. We're going to stick with those restrictions until we get to 0. Okay. And then you open up, and of course you get a flat line 0. But what you've shown is the mistakes in policy where people thought, oh, it's all over, we can relax. And bang, of course, the virus doesn't relax.
Yeah.
And the thing about a virus, which we all should know, we don't realize it can't live unless it has a host. And if you cut a host out, then ultimately it will die out, will just degrade as a chemical on the surface of the planet somewhere, and then the virus is gone. And because we didn't do it, we're stuck with this, and we've delegitimized one of the most effective ways of controlling it. And I think we're stuck with this if we're lucky, we're stuck with it for a decade. And it's an appalling outcome to have, and partly not being able to visualize what you now enable us to visualize is one of the reasons why it happened.
The silver lining is with global warming, we're bound to have another pandemic in the next 20 years. And hopefully, if we haven't all boiled to death by that point, we'll have learned the lessons from this pandemic and, attack that first wave ferociously, whether it means being locked down for a year to eradicate it, because now, like you said,
don't say a year, because that'll turn off anybody even thinking about it. But the point that Yanir made is that it's about 2 weeks. Yanir's policy was a lockdown which starts where the only services allowed are essential, and that of course involves all the medical system, transportation for food, maintaining internet, and a few other. You could say these are the things we absolutely have to have. You workers therefore have to go to work. As much safety as we can do when you're there, but you're the ones everybody else, you're in your house, food gets delivered, okay, you don't go out, and after 2 weeks you then know which households have the disease. Now, in the very early stages of the pandemic, that would have been maybe 2% of households. So like after, maybe let's say 5%. Well, after 2 weeks, 95% can do what they like, okay? You're back into freedom of movement. And then the 5% that are isolated out, the ones who have got the disease are often in both medical treatment and quarantine, and the ones that haven't in their house who haven't got it yet, we then watch them for another 2 weeks. And then that means you've eliminated it from the 5% who did have it, and then another 2 weeks to cover those who are actually working, because some of those who are working would have had the disease and passed it on. So Yanir's policy was within 6 weeks, we could have eliminated the virus completely. Okay? Yeah. And that would have been one lockdown, would have worked. But instead we've had lockdown after lockdown after lockdown, and the legitimacy of this has been destroyed. And I think if we tried it again with the disease, which had as low virulence as COVID has, you wouldn't get any compliance at all. It would only be if we got a virus which is on the way towards Ebola levels. Holy shit, I'm going to die if I get this. And, I can't just say the old people, it's going to be the young people as well. Then we might get something serious. But I think this has actually weakened us for a future pandemic. It hasn't. We haven't learned from it.
Well said. Well, guys, we're at the top of the hour. I think that's going to do it for this week. Tyrone,
applause.
Yeah, good job, Tyrone. Great job. We're going to love to have you back and have you as a part of the team. And until next week, thanks for tuning in. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, indeed. Okay.
Thanks, Tyrone.
See ya.